Welcome to NYU Washington, D.C. My name is Audra Grant, and I am a professor on this campus, and I'm going to be moderating tonight's discussion. Thank you very much for joining us this evening, again, and coming out after work. I'm sure some of you might be a little tired, but hopefully the discussion this evening will give you some energy. So we're really looking forward to your participation and asking some interesting questions. Just by way of introduction of who I am, I, again, am an adjunct professor here at NYU. I was also a professor at the George Washington University, where I taught a graduate seminar in North African politics. I'm affiliated with the RAND Corporation as a political scientist. And prior to my work at RAND, I was with the State Department in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, where I focused on public opinion. Throughout my career, I've done public opinion throughout most of the Middle East, including Iran in various capacities. So tonight's discussion will indeed incorporate some public opinion components, at least based on some of the questions I will ask. But we're live streaming this event on the internet to our NYU global campuses, including here on Washington Square, New York. And the content will be available for instant viewing on our website at the conclusion of this discussion this evening. Iran is a nation of enormous strategic consequence. It is the Middle East's most populous country with over 80 million citizens, 60% of whom are under the age of 30. It has the world's largest oil and gas reserves, controls the Straits of Hormuz, and shares land borders with Iraq, Turkey, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. The country's growing nuclear program and support for terror have caused it to be the subject of international sanctions, as most of us may already know, yet also remains an indispensable party to any comprehensive and durable peace in the region. Just to give you an idea of the public temperature on some of these issues more currently, a University of Tehran Center for Public Opinion Research and the University of Maryland conducted a poll in 2014 which reveals that 94% of Iranians say it's necessary for their country to have a nuclear energy program, and 70% believe that the program's expansion is for peaceful energy. Only 20% believe that it's to develop nuclear weapons. So public opinion feels very strongly about this issue as well. This event is also timely given events that have happened here in Washington. We've had Netanyahu come and say a few words to Congress, and also the authoring of a letter by 47 senators from the U.S. Senate opposing a nuclear deal, or opposing a U.S. nuclear deal with Iran. So tonight we're going to talk about what's been happening in the region, and we're going to look at this controversy over deals being brokered by the Obama administration. Please, at this moment, welcome our panel, as they will take a few moments to introduce themselves before we begin. We can start here with our panelists nearest to my left.
Well, hi, Professor Grant. Good evening, everyone. My name is Lincoln Bloomfield. I'm the chairman of the Stimson Center, which is a nonpartisan security think tank in Washington. It's not a real job since it's a pro bono role as a trustee. I'm a former government official who served for 8 years in the Pentagon during the 2 Reagan administrations, briefly in the White House in the first Bush administration for a year. I served under James Baker at the State Department in the Middle East Bureau as a Deputy Assistant Secretary, was Political Military Assistant Secretary of State under Colin Powell, and came back as a special envoy to try to secure aviation against the threat of shoulder-fired missiles. In private life, I'm doing a bunch of other things, one of which was to examine what's being said about Iran in Washington, and what is commonly understood about Iran and those who criticize it from the outside. And I wrote a book a couple of years ago about the history of the resistance to the regime in Iran that simply was a way of trying to put the facts up against the allegations and see if we may have a problem with intelligence here in Washington.
Thanks, first of all, to NYU for hosting us for this timely discussion. Blaise Mishtal. I direct the National Security Program at the Bipartisan Policy Center, which is a think tank here in Washington devoted, as the name may suggest, to coming up with bipartisan solutions to pressing national problems. I largely deal with things that go boom. I've been working on Iran's nuclear program for the better part of 7 or 8 years now. I've also worked on issues related to failed states, including with Ambassador Bloomfield quite a number of years ago, cybersecurity, Russia, Ukraine, U.S.-Turkey relations, and other issues as well, but Iran has been a mainstay of my work.
Thank you again for the invitation. And I direct the Middle East program at the Center for the National Interest, which was founded by President Richard Nixon. And we published the magazine, The National Interest. And previously, I was working with Secretary Baker and Ambassador Ed Derejian down in Texas at Rice University at the Baker Institute, where we worked on many initiatives related to Syria, the Gulf. I was an editor to the largest media group in the Arab world, which published Sharq al-Awsat in Arab news, and then have written some for Al Arabiya. So largely looking at kind of the regional dimensions from the Gulf and broader Arab perspective on Arab-Iranian relations. So that's my background. Thank you.
And thank you, Professor Grant, and also NYU Washington for this opportunity. My name is Ali Safavi, and I'm a member of the Iran's Parliament in Exile, the National Council of Resistance of Iran, which seeks to establish a democratic, secular, non-nuclear republic in Iran in place of the current ruling theocracy. I also serve as the spokesperson for the NCRI's U.S. Representative Office. I've been active in Iranian politics for about 40 years, and of course, have worked a great deal in trying to educate the American public, members of Congress, and policymakers about the perils of appeasing the regime in Tehran, and of course, suggest some policy alternative in terms of how to go forward in dealing with the threats that this regime poses, not only to the Iranian people, but to the rest of the region.
Thank you very much. Okay. Well, I guess I'll start then by asking a few questions. The prospects of a nuclear deal here in the U.S. has obviously generated a great deal of controversy and concern, both among Democrats and Republicans and the wider public. One angle of this issue that has been discussed less in the U.S. has been the response of other countries in Iran's neighborhood. What would be the response of Iran's GCC neighbors to a nuclear deal? Do we risk sparking an arms race in the Middle East?
Maybe I'll start. You've just touched on what I think is the most important sort of, maybe not public opinion, but the most important opinion, because no matter what we in Washington or at the negotiating table or in Congress may decide about a prospective deal, the real vote and the acid test resides in other capitals. I was in the Gulf in 2006 when the Director of Intelligence of Saudi Arabia, Prince Mukrin, stood up at the Bahrain Security Conference and said, the Arabs will not allow Iran to have any weapon that we don't have. I was with a former Secretary of Defense on a private trip, so I can say what happened. We went and visited Prince Mukrin, who is now, as of the succession, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. And we also visited with the then Crown Prince, Prince Sultan, who has passed away. And in those discussions, it became clear that they didn't think they needed power very much. They have a lot of oil and gas, right? And not that their populations are not overwhelming yet. But they wanted nuclear energy in order to have a hedge against what Iran might do. So their opinion counts a lot. Obviously, you heard from Prime Minister Netanyahu. To the extent that he represents Israeli public opinion, we'll know that soon on the 17th. But in any case, I don't think we get to make that judgment. I think it really boils down to stopping an arms race, which is a psychological perception in the Middle East. And it's imperative that we not trigger an arms race, a nuclear arms race in the Middle East.
I would just echo that. Dennis Ross, who is a former Middle East peace negotiator for both President Clinton and involved with the Obama administration with his Iran policy early on, wrote an op-ed in the New York Times a couple of years ago where he said, the king of Saudi Arabia now passed away, told me quite bluntly regarding Iran, you must cut off the head of the snake. And I think that's sort of been clearly in public meetings, as Ambassador Bloomfield has said, the policy of the Gulf states all along. They might see Iran as an even bigger threat than Prime Minister Netanyahu did when he spoke to Congress last week. And so it's not really a question of whether a deal is even acceptable to the U.S. and acceptable to our Congress, but it's also how that deal is going to be perceived in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and in Riyadh and other capitals. I think the possibility of a nuclear arms race is very possible, regardless of whether there's a deal or not. And it's entirely based on the perceptions of others in the region about whether a deal does enough to rein in Iran.
But certainly building on perceptions that really, despite large differences within the GCC, there is one common broader strategic fear, and that is Iran developing a nuclear weapon. But on the other hand, I do think at the moment, from some conversations in Riyadh and Doha, is that there is some pragmatism of saying that we really want to see what is on the table and what has been agreed to, because as much as Doha and Riyadh may be in consultations now in considering a nuclear program, they would probably prefer at the moment to see if this deal prevents Iran from acquiring such a weapon. But certainly if it falls apart, a number of senior Gulf officials have said to me is that it would be of the interest of them for the United States to take military action against the program. So I think it's really wait and see, and they are largely, frankly, in a constrained position, one they might not necessarily want to be in, but I think at the moment this is the position they have found with President Obama's administration.
I think what I would add to this argument is that while, of course, the concern is a legitimate one that if the Iranian regime acquires nuclear weapons, that it might prompt other countries in the region to also try to get their hands on a nuclear weapon. I think, however, that that's not the crux of the issue. I think the underlying reality is that when you're facing a regime like the one in Iran, which, of course, as part of its constitution says it wants to establish global Islamic rule, if they do acquire nuclear weapons, I think you would see the entire security of the Middle East region undermined. And whether or not the Saudis or some of the Gulf countries were able to get their hands on a nuclear bomb, I think there would not be any match for a country like Iran with 80 million population, with enormous resources in that part of the world. So I think the issue has to be to do everything that is possible, short of going to war with Iran, to prevent it from getting its hands on a nuclear weapon.
Thank you. There has been some concern, as some of you alluded to, about whether or not Iran can be relied on to follow through with any agreements. The IAEA, which has responsibility for monitoring and verification of any agreement, has historically been unable to prevent Iran from cheating. Okay? What will make this agreement any different? Can we expect something else?
Let me let others start off here.
Ali, you want to start?
Well, I think that's a very, very good question. And we find it ironic that with the P5+1 getting involved in these negotiations, IAEA has pretty much been marginalized. And I'm sure you have seen from time to time the Director General of the IAEA complaining about the fact that Iran is unresponsive to their concerns and their questions. It's interesting that when you talk about monitoring and verification, of the 11 outstanding questions that the IAEA has with regards to Iran's nuclear weapons program, its research and development, its PMD, possible military dimensions of its activities, that only one out of these 11 questions have been answered by the Iranian regime. So clearly, it is obvious that IAEA's hands are very much tied, and to be honest, I do not believe that there is sufficient mechanism to verify whether Iran is abiding by its agreements or whether it's cheating.
And I do agree with that. And I think there is a deep risk about the breakout period. And frankly, it really comes down to kind of this whole, as much as Susan Rice said recently, this whole we don't trust but we will verify, which she said at APAC. It's hard to see how much of that window of the until we verify in that situation without them acquiring such a capability. And I know there's debate about the breakout capability, but I think one point to make on that is to keep in mind is really it comes down to whether or not Khamenei is making the decision that he wants pragmatically to reduce these economic sanctions and put aside a nuclear program, or frankly, will ideology and internal constituents override that? And I think that is The risk is, will that happen now or in 2 years from now? He points to a situation where the U.S. violated the deal, or he thought that it was at different terms, and once he has those economic sanctions lifted and too many U.S. and Japanese companies or Asian companies are invested in, it's hard to put those sanctions back on. But I think it's quite risky, if that's...
So I think to parse your question a little more finely, there's a difference between monitoring and verification and prevention and enforcement. And what the IAEA does is monitor and verify. And it does so at present rather imperfectly. It's very much limited in where it can go, how frequently it can go there, and even who it can bring into the country to do its inspections. Iran has quite famously refused to sign a document called the Additional Protocol, which is sort of an enhanced inspections document which would allow the IAEA to go to whatever facilities it feels like there might be nuclear activities at. So right now the IAEA can only go to places where Iran will let it go. It has to give a certain amount of notice prior, depending on what sort of facility it's at. But even if there was full transparency, which is hopefully something that a deal would put in place, transparency by itself doesn't prevent cheating, right? If Iran believes that it can cheat and no one's going to do anything about it, it doesn't matter whether we know and the IAEA catches them or not. So the issue really isn't just about monitoring and verification, it's about having in place some sort of system to punish transgressions if and when they happen. And I think what we've seen repeatedly over the last however many years this has been going on, at least back to 2004 when we found out about Iran's first enrichment, the consequences have been pretty small. IAEA itself can only refer things to the UN Security Council. The UN Security Council can pass resolutions. It's passed 6 at this point, calling for Iran to suspend all nuclear enrichment-related activities. Clearly, Iran hasn't felt the need to do that. It hasn't even felt the need to come clean about the extent of its nuclear program, as Ali was saying. So there's a big difference between just monitoring and verifying and the enforcement part of it. And I think that's really what will be in question when we look at a deal, if there is one, in fact.
I do have a view on this, Audra, which I don't know what the deal will say. But what has mystified me as I look at the negotiation is maybe I'm simple-minded, and maybe this is more complicated than anything I've encountered either in business or in government. But if the proposition is to ask a country of 80 million people and a leadership that has divine power to forego nuclear weapons, wouldn't you expect to put the question to the supreme leader in a way that says, make this an act of statesmanship? We invite you to offer your end of the deal, which is, I will forego nuclear weapons, not because sanctions brought me to my knees, not because the Treasury Department is stronger than the Persian Empire, led by the Veliyat Faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurists. That just doesn't seem sensible to me. You'd need to, whatever you might think about the supreme leader and the regime, and I have my views, I would invite them to save face and to make it an act of statesmanship. And we haven't done that, nor have we given them a quid pro quo that's sort of consummate with that act of statesmanship, which is to let 80 million Iranians know that we will go to the UN. We will re-legislate the sanctions. There will be some left behind for other issues. But that deal's never appeared. So instead, I feel sorry for my friends in the government. I may be prejudging the outcome, but it looks to me as though no one in Iran is debating anything. As you've said, the supreme leader can sort of sit back and play this one out. Maybe the sanctions will melt away. Maybe the enforcement won't detect certain activities, and there are new ones that have been announced in recent days that need to be checked out. But the Americans are in a debate with everyone they know. The Israeli prime minister is yelling at them from the well of Congress. The Turks and the Egyptians and the Saudis and maybe the Emiratis and the other Gulf states are very skeptical of what's going to happen here. Every nuclear expert in Washington has a view on how many centrifuges are too many. Experts like Blaise are wondering whether the enforcement and monitoring mechanisms are sufficient. It's a big argument on our side of the table. Pretty tough hill to climb for the negotiating team. And not to mention the Congress.
And if I may add one more thing, when I think, the president was speaking to CBS News, I think, over the weekend, and he put a great deal of emphasis on the verification. But let's, for the sake of argument, let's say tomorrow there is some evidence that Iran is cheating. Of course, the Iranian regime is going to be denying it, How are we going to prove it? And so this will go back and forth, and by the time you arrive as to whether, in fact, Iran has cheated or not, you've lost 1 year. But even if you confirm that Iran has cheated, are they going to abandon the deal that they have worked so hard for over a small act of deception on the part of the Iranian regime? So clearly, I think that banking on whether you can really verify the actions of the regime, a regime, remember, that has been involved in denial, deception, and duplicity for 30 years. It has none of its nuclear projects. It has come forward and told the IAEA. Every single one has been revealed either by the NCRI or by other intelligence agencies of foreign countries. So the question to me is the Iranian regime a trustworthy partner? Who are we negotiating with? And so I think that's the issue that, unfortunately, it seems to me has been lost in the course of these discussions over the past year and a half.
Okay, well, I'll move on to the next question. Now, a contrasting situation. The United States has consistently refused to allow the Republic of Korea to enrich uranium, arguing that the risks of proliferation are too great and that commercial supplies of low-enriched uranium, LEU, are sufficient to meet the country's power needs. If this is our position with regard to a major non-NATO ally, why are we being so much more lax and permissive with a state that is actively supporting revolutionary movements around the globe?
Well, I'll give you my view. It's a little bit of a 50,000-foot view and a long view of events. I will first of all say I don't know what's in the deal with Iran. But secondly, the Non-Proliferation Treaty worked. I mean, John F. Kennedy predicted 25 or 30 nuclear powers by the end of the 20th century, and there were 7 or 8. It worked. And it worked for physical reasons because of the institutions that were created and the technical capabilities of intelligence and cooperation between countries. And it worked because of the psychology that said there aren't going to be any more nuclear powers. There aren't going to be any more sort of nuclear weapons will no longer be the high card that states play in trying to exert their quest for power in the world. We're going to exert power on economic grounds, on cultural grounds, on other grounds, technological grounds, but not nuclear. That's the Cold War. We're moving beyond it. Now, and I will say something that will raise some eyebrows, it really did surprise me and somewhat trouble me that we allowed India, essentially, to have a deal that we would never have given to anyone else. And I was sort of party to what we did in Argentina and Brazil and how South Africa rolled back their program. People got out of the nuclear business. But India, because they are a great nation, and don't get me wrong, I think India never once thought that they should play along with rules being set by this young democracy in North America. They see themselves as a great civilization, and I understand that. And they never wanted to be part of what they considered to be a faction, and they thought that this was an American sort of John Foster Dulles, if you will, type club that allowed the nuclear powers to have a monopoly, and everyone else had to be second class. They waited for 30 or 40 years, and they got what they wanted. So when you concede that, how do you think that affected the North Korean negotiations or the Iran negotiations, which were sort of ongoing? I asked the negotiators at that time, and they looked to all the world that they'd never even considered the question. You need to look globally and historically and understand that you're setting norms. So we have work to do if we're going to roll back nuclear proliferation. We really have to act like we mean it.
Speaking of questions that aren't considered, I think one that isn't raised about this deal is what will its impact be on our ability to keep up the international non-proliferation regime. And you can look much closer to North Korea, which is the UAE, with whom we signed a 1-2-3 agreement a couple of years ago, which was called the gold standard in non-proliferation. And one of the things the UAE wanted, and one of the things we denied them, was enrichment capability. Basically, we share our nuclear technology with them. We help them build nuclear reactors so they have nuclear power, but we put in place limits on those programs so they can't proliferate and break out to nuclear weapons. So, in effect, if we sign a deal with Iran, which allows them to continue enriching uranium, which we believe it will because the framework for a comprehensive deal that was included in the interim deal that was signed in November 2013 already recognizes a right to continue enriching uranium. So if Iran is allowed to enrich uranium, a country that, as Ali said, has cheated numerous times, has American blood on its hands, and we believe was trying to make a nuclear weapon, and we don't allow countries that are allies to enrich uranium, that's a double standard that's going to be hard to keep up in the long term. And I think for a number of reasons, especially that one, but also going back to the fact that there's 6 UN Security Council resolutions that demand that Iran cease its nuclear enrichment-related activities that we're not going to enforce if the deal ends up looking like what we think it's going to look like. The international non-proliferation regime is going to crumble as a result of this deal.
I do think it is often difficult to draw a comparison to some degrees between Seoul and Tehran, just in terms of a leverage, a position in relationship with the United States. And there is the argument for pursuing a deal is, frankly, is that if we didn't do this, Iran could acquire a nuclear weapon. And I think that is something that, in the case of South Korea, will not happen. And it's one of those things, in an ideal world, there would not be Iranian enrichment. But at the moment, Ayatollah Khamenei has decided to go down that path. And I do think that as a result, there needs to be some negotiating, and keeping in mind as well Iranian nationalism and the position, as on mentioning, if India has a bomb and Pakistan and others do, then why is it the US's responsibility and others to say that Iran can't have a bomb? And I think that is something that, as much as I don't particularly agree with that logic, but it is one that very much in the case of Iran, where we are to a degree forced to negotiate to some extent to try to get them to not go to further breakout capacity, because frankly, a military strike against Iran may not necessarily work, and also drags us potentially into another war in the Middle East, which I don't think really the United States really wants to do at this point, after what we've seen in Iraq and in Afghanistan. So I think there is an argument for having to work with them to a degree if it is a good deal.
I agree with Blaise when he said that the approach to Seoul and Tehran represents a double standard. I completely agree. Winston Churchill said that however beautiful the strategy, it's sometimes useful to look at the results. And when you look at the results of the American policy toward Iran over the past 36 years, I must say the result has been pretty harmful, not only to the Iranian people, not only to the people of the region, but also to American national security interests. Look, when the first secret site was revealed in 2002, Iran didn't have that many centrifuges. Iran wasn't running around in Iraq. It wasn't backing up Bashar Assad. It wasn't financing the Houthis in Yemen. Where are we now? Now, in addition to the nuclear threat, you have to be concerned about Iranian nefarious activities all around the region. In fact, just yesterday, the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard said what is happening in Iraq now represents a phase in the expansion of export of terrorism. You have to remember that when you talk about Iran, you're not talking about India. You're not talking about North Korea. You're not even talking about Pakistan. You're talking about a regime which says, in fact, it went to war with Iraq for 8 years because it said it wanted to liberate Jerusalem via Karbala. This is the mentality and the mindset in Tehran. That's the mentality and mindset of Khamenei. That's the thinking of Rouhani and everybody else in that regime. So clearly, to us, it's mind-boggling that the United States, as you said, is not allowing one of its non-NATO allies not to enrich, but has recognized the right of the Iranian regime to enrichment. That I think, at the end of the day, is like shooting ourselves in the foot.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Well, on to then a related question. Is there evidence or reason to believe that Iran's leadership has the intention to reduce its support for these movements in Iran, in Lebanon, specifically Hezbollah, Israel, that would be Hamas, Yemen, Houthis, Iraq, Shia militias, and Syria in support of Assad? How will concessions on the nuclear program lead to improved behavior in this area and in human rights?
Well, that's a hot button question, if I may say so. A couple of years ago, I wrote an article in the National Interest, which I recommend everyone read on a daily basis. It's a great journal, which looked at Secretary Kerry's ambitious diplomacy in the region, Syria, Palestine, and Iran. And on Iran, sort of cautioned against allowing our approach to everything other than nuclear issues to bleed into the imperative mission of making sure that Iran doesn't get a nuclear weapon. And I say imperative that even if you thought you could live with the Iranian bomb, and there are people who've written articles to that effect, the president has drawn a red line. He's drawn the reddest of red lines. The one on Syria, he sort of reluctantly put together a chemical weapons agreement, which many will say was violated at least 6 times after it was concluded with using chlorine. But the red line that Iran will not have the bomb, I invite you to look at statements from the State Department on a daily basis. And Ambassador Samantha Power was just in Israel saying, we will not allow Iran to get the bomb, period. That is a big promise. That's a presidential promise. So I'll stop talking about the red line, but if he doesn't live up to that, then this has long-term strategic consequences for the United States and our influence in the world that would be very deleterious. I have a theory about these negotiations. I've watched them closely, and I previewed it 2 years ago in this article, which is, if you wanted to cut this deal, you would draw a bright line and say, we respectfully disagree on a lot of issues in the region, and we reserve the right to follow our own national interest in every other matter. But on nuclear, let's make a deal. Sanctions relief for the supreme leader saying, I don't want the bomb, and let 80 million Iranian citizens hear that they're going to get relief and that they don't want the bomb. Let's have it as an act of statesmanship. Instead, there is no message in Iran. It's sort of everyone wants enrichment, that's a national right, and yeah, we want sanctions relief, and what are we offering them? I'm waiting to find out, but I'll tell you one thing we did give them. We were hands-off for the last 2 years, hands-off as Bashar al-Assad barrel-bombed 3 million people into neighboring countries and killed 200,000. We were hands-off as Hezbollah, who killed the US Marines, and I was the desk officer in the Pentagon when they did that. And they were running weapons flows in and out of Syria. We didn't touch them. We were hands-off as the al-Houthi were coming down from the north, sort of indifferent when there was a joint government about 2 months ago in Sana'a, and now all the embassies have fled because the Houthis have taken over with explosive guns. You read the New York Times, all smuggled in from Iran. In fact, the late father of al-Houthi spent, a year in Qum. So people don't seem to know these things. Even in Gaza, where there was a war with Israel, very destructive war, frankly, on both sides, and for the prospects of peace. Long-range rockets were smuggled to Hamas from where? The Revolutionary Guards of Iran. And we did nothing about any of these things. We've sort of said nothing about these things. And now you have pictures of all the Ayatollahs adorning the buildings in Baghdad, where so many Americans died and were wounded. That's the result. We thought we didn't want to muss their hair while we were negotiating in Vienna. I think that's what they wanted all along, was to paralyze our diplomacy so that they could create essentially some sandbags to hold off the Arab Spring and the Persian Spring that was in their streets in 2009. I know that's a new idea, but I urge you to look into that. Think about this. That regime was in trouble in 2009, and they knew it. This time, Mr. Rouhani was one of 8 out of 876 candidates. Only 8 were allowed to run. So you tell me whether that was an engineered election and whether he was the choice of the regime. So this negotiation's been delayed time and time again. If they didn't want the deal, if they wanted the deal so badly, wouldn't they have made it by now? I haven't seen that. If we wanted it so badly, wouldn't we have gone to Congress to put more on the table to get the deal? I didn't see that either. Mm-hmm. So I have to be suspicious and wonder whether the one thing we've seen is Iran essentially pushing out the sandbags to the Mediterranean and to Yemen to sort of keep democracy and the young generational wave that swept the region from their borders, and they've done it.
Thank you.
I'd go beyond that and suggest it's not just a strategically defensive move, but it's offensive as well, not only as an expression of their revolutionary ideology and belief that they should be ruling the entirety of the region, but also as a negotiating tactic or part of their larger approach to the United States. And in a way, ISIS is the best thing that ever happened to Iran when it comes to the United States. Because not only do we not want another war in the Middle East to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, we don't really want another war in the Middle East to go after ISIS. And Iran has presented itself as, in the midst of all the sectarian violence, as a savior, as a stabilizing force that is training the Iraqi troops, providing them with weaponry and helping them retake Tikrit in recent days, and positioned itself to sort of be, and they've articulated this, present themselves as a partner for the United States and bring stability back to the Middle East at a time when they're in fact doing the exact opposite and fanning the flames of sectarian conflict throughout the region. But the narrative that they're able to present, because of the overriding threat of ISIS, is that they're the ones who can defeat this threat that we don't want to get our hands dirty or our boots dirty to do ourselves. And so because they can present themselves as a strategic partner, that makes the case for normalizing relations and getting a deal all that much stronger. Right? We need a deal not only to prevent them from getting a nuclear weapon, but to finally get a partner in the Middle East that can help us clean up the mess without having to get engaged ourselves. And so it's not just a defensive move, I think it's also an offensive strategic move.
I think it goes back on it's kind of an irony that the poster child of the anti-ISIL campaign is Qasem Soleimani, kind of marching across Iraq, being in Syria, the main man who was responsible largely for many of the efforts against U.S. forces in Iraq, and also the main architect of many of the policies in Syria in keeping Bashar al-Assad in power. And I think there is a slight contradiction where President Obama has said a number of times that he's not seeing this as a real reset of U.S.-Iranian relations, in terms of not seeing this as this kind of grand bargain. But frankly, really what he has not answered as much is really, if you do take, after you sign this deal, and you do deliver potentially on economic sanctions, then what really policies are you going to do to really constrain and limit Iran's actions in places like Iraq, in Yemen, and other parts where they are threatening American national interests? And I do think before we give them this kind of blank check free sanctions ride, they have to be accountable to a degree on their behavior in other parts of the region. And I think that is a fine balance, but it strikes me that there has not been much strategic thought into how do you promise sanction relief, but you also make sure you hold Iran accountable for other issues. And that is something as well that many Gulf leaders feel uncomfortable about. And it really comes down to that. And frankly, one final note on that is if you look at Ayatollah Khamenei's Twitter, whether he writes it himself, he spends every day kind of denouncing the United States, recently misquoting President Carter, saying that President Carter was saying that 230 women are enslaved in the United States. It just isn't interesting that as the U.S. is working towards this deal, Khamenei is spending a lot of time on Twitter condemning the United States. So it doesn't really seem to me like a great partner in the region once we lift these sanctions.
Thank you, Andrew. Ali, did you want to comment?
Yes, first of all, I completely agree with Andrew. I think that whatever diplomacy is being pursued now, I think it has fallen into a strategic vacuum. Because when you look at it, despite some rhetoric, there is absolutely no specific strategic agenda vis-a-vis Iran's mischievous behavior, not only in the region but also at home. Recall that this regime relies on two elements. One, domestic suppression. Two, export of terrorism and crisis. I haven't seen any assertion of the positions of the United States vis-a-vis these two issues, if and when an agreement is reached, disregarding, of course, the problems that this agreement already has. So what is the United States going to be? And I think if you look at the past 30-year history, I think the more concessions you give to the mullahs, the more brazen and emboldened they become. And clearly, the events of the past year or so, the very open involvement of Iran in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, I think it's, from our perspective, by and large because they haven't felt the heat from the United States and the P5+1, they feel that they can get away with it. And so quite frankly, as the final answer to your question, I think it has to be completely reversed in that you have to be tough on Iran if you wanted to modify its behavior in the rest of the region. Giving it concessions, would only embolden it and encourage it to do more.
So it sounds as though the consensus of the panel, just based on these comments that you said, for example, what hasn't been answered are, what policies will constrain and limit Iran's actions, particularly those that threaten U.S. interests in the region. Has this administration made a strong enough case for making some kind of nuclear deal with Iran? Has that case been made strongly enough?
Well, I think the problem really is that the nuclear issue is only one outstanding issue that the international community has with the regime in Iran. And I do not believe that you can address this nuclear threat in a piecemeal fashion. I think the nuclear issue, Iran's support for terrorism, and its unprecedented domestic suppression, I think they have to be addressed in a totality. You need a comprehensive strategy. And I submit to you that, let's say tomorrow, the international community reaches a deal with Iran over its nuclear program. Do you think they're going to be doing anything that would endanger that deal? I seriously doubt it. And so that is why we think that parallel with everything that is being done to prevent Iran from going nuclear, I think there must be concrete, serious efforts done to force Iran to compel the Iranian regime to stop its domestic suppression and to stop its involvement in Syria and in Iraq. And this is very, very dangerous. If the Iranian regimes get the upper hand in Iraq, they've gained what they lost with the ouster of Maliki. And they have said that for us, Damascus, Baghdad, and Beirut are the strategic depth. So I think that in this sense, I think the administration, at least from our perspective, hasn't made a case to get a nuclear deal with Iran, not only because of the problems of the negotiations, but also because it has failed to address two of the very, very important issues as it relates to Iranian people, as it relates to the people of the region.
Thank you, Ali. Andrew?
I think one thing to keep in mind, as much as I did not entirely agree with some of the methods of Senator Cotton's letter, I do think it underscores that 47 senators in the U.S. Senate and a good fair majority of the House of Representatives has deep concerns about the deal. And frankly, I think it also underlines similar and other policy initiatives that President Obama has been reluctant and not that very effective in really working across the aisle and working with the Republican leadership in Congress. And as much as people can bemoan Netanyahu's speech and Senator Cotton's letter, I do think it shows that, frankly, there's not a united domestic consensus on the administration's policies. And I think he has to do a better job selling that deal to Congress.
Thank you. Please.
I think the case for why we want to have a deal or should have a deal is pretty easy to make, and I think Andrew made it earlier. I don't think there's very many people, hopefully not any, in the United States who think that a nuclear Iran is a good idea if it can be avoided, and it'd be much better to avoid it peacefully and diplomatically than militarily if those are the two choices. So is a deal a good idea? Probably yes. The question is what sort of deal? And so the question is, President Obama has asked us not to judge a deal until we see a deal, and that's fair, but the question is what sort of job will he do defending that deal and telling us why it's a good deal when it does arrive. I would just point out that the experiences of 2003 should make us fairly wary of taking everyone's word for it or taking our leaders' word for it when we make momentous national security decisions, and that we really should have a vibrant national discussion around them. But when you have a deal that's going to be as complex as this one, it's going to be really hard to do that. I don't know how many members of the public are ready to parse out numbers of centrifuges versus separative work units versus kilograms of LEU versus signing on to additional protocols versus phasing out of sanctions and law. So it's going to be such a big and technical deal that I don't know how we're going to be able to talk about it meaningfully as a public. And while I think the sentiment of Senator Cotton's letter is certainly true, Congress deserves a say in this. I think one of my concerns about that letter would be if it makes it harder for Congress to be an objective and reasonable and principled voice in discussing the deal. That would be a shame for our democracy, because we really need someone not just to take the president's word for it, but really ask the American people, what does this deal mean, and try to explain it to them and think through, is this a good deal for the U.S. or not?
Thank you, Blaise.
I would-
Ambassador Bloomfield,
I would
please.
just introduce a question or two for you as you think through these questions. These are very valuable comments, and I'm interested in what Ali had to say about you have to address everything to do with the regime, and I take that point, but I also think that from a U.S. government perspective, there really is nothing, no suite of tools you could put together to come to an accord with this regime. And yet regime change is such a dirty word, it clouds the conversation. People doesn't lead to intelligent discourse in Washington when you use that term. And so what I think has gone wrong here is that we have been unclear about what we want and how we're going to get it. And it seems to me that we've treated Iran sort of like a courtship, that with Mr. Rouhani's announcement that he was coming to the UN in the fall of 2013, and then sending out tweets, and Foreign Minister Zarif, who's very engaging, doing YouTube videos in English, appealing to the American people. USIP has had listing the Twitter accounts from the foreign minister that were very congenial and sort of very good at image building. And so we wanted to be on our best behavior, and we wanted to be respectful, and I would always be respectful, even with no matter who I was negotiating with. And don't forget, I was trying to get weapons from dangerous people and warlords and whatnot when I was a special envoy. But you can't go in and spit in somebody's face. You have to find some basis to negotiate on some kind of level ground. My point is that this regime is very tough. If you look at the history of how they got there, that revolution didn't have their name on it when the Shah fell. They took it over very bloodily, and they hung on through a lot of bloodshed, and they've been very clever. So when we say that the Americans have conceded too much at the table on nuclear, maybe, but I think the bigger concession was when we said that Bashar al-Assad must go. We mobilized forces, we were ready to use force, then we backed off from congressional backing, and then we backed off altogether. And Bashar al-Assad wasn't even negotiated away at the meetings in Geneva. All of that went away. This was a hugely important strategic sort of connection for Tehran. In fact, there were statements inside Iran that said, if we lose Damascus, we cannot hold Tehran. So this was a vital interest for the regime to hold on in Iran. Similarly, with Hezbollah, had we compelled Bashar al-Assad, not by bombing the rubble in Syria the way everyone else has, but just by some strategic military action to try to get the Syrian military to defect and to get Bashar and his crowd to leave and to negotiate a transfer from within that community, Sunni or Alawi, that would have been hard, but it's not as hard as what we've ended up with. And you know how Israel and Hezbollah have fought, and how Hezbollah is a non-state actor that's armed almost as well or better than many states in the world. And we've done nothing to degrade them. This was an organization that was in trouble in Lebanon. People were saying, you're supposed to be a resistance group against Israel. You're killing Sunni Muslims in Syria. What are you doing? They were in deep trouble. They were fighting over grave sites 2 years ago. We didn't do anything. So I would just offer that proposition, and then I would ask the question, shouldn't we revisit the question of whether sanctions really are such a coercive tool? I think the Iranian regime is doing just fine with sanctions. If you look at the sanctions that were on Libya, Milosevic in Yugoslavia, Saddam Hussein, by the time they all left, they had tens of billions of dollars raked off the top. How did they get that money? Scarcity from sanctions. So that the population suffers grievously. And I'm always troubled, quite frankly, that in dictatorships, we punish the dictators by punishing all the people who had nothing to do with it. I don't like punishing 80 million Iranians. I don't like them resenting me as the one who's punishing them. I want to engage the Iranian people. We should love the Iranian people. It's a great culture. There's nothing not to like about the people of Iran. It's the regime. And so I think we should revisit the tools. They've taken over all the information space. They have an intranet that's run by the Revolutionary Guards. They have TV stations. They can't find out where all the money went. The mullahs have they have control over all the major industries of Iran. They make more money from BMWs and refrigerators and everything else than they do from oil and gas. So I don't think they're suffering. And the Revolutionary Guards profit from sanctions because they control access to resources. So I honestly think that if we were to put a big sanctions package on the table, it would be very, very hard for the regime to live in a free and open Iran. So I'll just put that out there for you to consider.
Thank you. Thank you for all those insights. I think at this point, as our time goes short, I'd like to open the floor up now to questions from you all. Any questions? Okay, I see at least one. Yes, here?
Yeah.
Can you introduce yourself?
All right.
And I think there's a mic coming behind you.
All right. Is this on?
We can still hear you.
Okay, yeah, I'm fine. I don't need a mic. My name is Mackenzie Russell. I'm a student here at NYU and one of Dr. Audrey Grant's students. In Benjamin Netanyahu's speech, he warned against any deal, essentially saying that a bad deal is worse than no deal. What alternative did he have in mind, or was it purely a campaign stunt?
I
Right,
think
nothing to do with
well,
that
I think
question,
it's
by the
pretty,
way.
Mackenzie, I think you're sort of asking Americans to interpret Israeli political motives, and that's pretty hard to do. Some Americans can do it well. I can't. But the implication of that statement is that a good deal would be better than no deal. And in fact, he said there should be a good deal. He didn't spell it out, but he did say that.
And I'd point out that everyone in the administration, from President Obama to Secretary Kerry to Wendy Sherman, the chief negotiator with Iran, has said no deal is better than a bad deal. So that's a sentiment that's generally agreed with. I think there might be some disagreement about what constitutes a bad deal between Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Obama administration.
Even Supreme Leader Khamenei has said that no deal is better than a bad deal. So
Something we can all agree on.
And I think
Peace is breaking out.
just one point, and I'm not going to comment on the Israeli election, but more what one senior Israeli official said to me recently was the fact that even though there's a 99% chance that Iran would never use a nuclear weapon against us, there's always that 1%. And how do we live with that? And if you are the Israeli prime minister, it is a much more of an existential threat, which Prime Minister Netanyahu said in his APEC speech, more so than purely being a security threat in his view for the United States. So I do think there is just for differences of perspectives of Israel and the United States on those issues.
Thank you. Next question.
I'm Robert Batt. I've worked a lot in the Middle East, and over the years I've had people make comments, mostly Arabs, both Sunni and Shia, that the main issue with Iran is having a nuclear power on their border, mainly Pakistan. Is any kind of security in any of these negotiations that may alleviate any of those kind of fears within Iran? Remember that, I mean, this, and they expressed this as a Sunni Shia issue, that the fact that you have a Sunni population in Pakistan, which at times have been having Al-Qaeda influences in certain parts of the country, certainly does not make Shias very happy or feel safe.
Well, you would think that the threat of sort of terrorists coming out of the urban hovels of the madrasas in Pakistan with fissile material would be a very dangerous thing. But can you either deter it, dissuade it, or defeat it, or retaliate against it with a nuclear warhead? Probably not. So you would think that if that were your fear, you'd be cooperating with security institutions of countries all over the world and proving your bona fides as a good citizen to try to work very closely to capture these individuals before they can do any harm. I will just say as a side note for students who are studying Pakistan that you might sort of look at the evolution that's on the debate going on right now. It's more an India-Pakistan issue of actually broadening their nuclear arsenal in the tactical area. And that's a sensitive subject, but one that, a step that many of us, of course, in the US who are talking to Pakistan are trying to dissuade them from taking that step. But it's all oriented toward the South Asian continent.
I agree. That's very rational, though, and I'm not too sure if the thought process always in Iran may not be quite as rational as that.
No dispute with that.
Next question. Perhaps the gentleman just behind you, and then the gentleman on my left here.
Thank you. My name is Majid Salish from the Organization of Iranian American Communities in the United States. Struck me rather odd to be able to gauge the Iranian public's opinion, given the picture you have outlaid here of the oppression machine in Iran, which is realistic, given the State Department's documentation asserts that, the UN's documentation asserts that. So I would be skeptical as to trusting the level of assessment relative to Iranian public opinion regarding nuclear deal with Iran, whether you'd want nuclear weaponry or not. But my question is, I haven't yet heard a clear emphasis on the Iranian people. After all, we're talking about a highly articulated population who has, over the past century, had 3 revolutions, all homebred, each of them about 35, 30 years apart. We are right about that cusp. Why have the administration, I'm asking the panelists, why has this great nation discounted the Iranian population so much?
Well, if I may address your question, I think that's a very good point. I think when you talk about Iran policy, and of course we addressed some of the, let's say, shortcomings of the US policy toward Iran, I think the biggest shortcoming has been ignoring what the Iranian people desire, ignoring the street in Iran. It's interesting that the narrative in Washington is that the nuclear issue is an issue of national pride for the Iranian people. As an Iranian, I can tell you that that is very far from reality in Iran. Just the past week, there has been demonstrations and protests in various cities of Iran by Iranian teachers. And one of the slogans that they have been chanting is, we don't want all this money spent on the nuclear program, we want our unpaid wages. You know, they've made a sort of fun out of this nuclear business because the regime protagonists in Iran say, energy hastei haqq musallame mast, which means nuclear energy is our inalienable right. The teachers are saying, حقوق ناداده ما حق مسلم ماست, which means our unpaid wages are our unalienable right. And so clearly when it comes to the Iranian people, I'm sitting here in this hall, I don't care whether this energy is nuclear energy or produced from other sources of energy. Iranian people don't care how they get their energy. After all, remember that Iran has 300 years of oil and gas reserves, and they haven't engaged in any kind of fracking yet. I assume they would have for 1,000 years. So clearly, I think that is where the failure of the US policy has been. And when I talk about a comprehensive strategy, the one key missing element are the Iranian people and those opposition individuals and groups who are trying to bring about a very different Iran. And I think unless and until this issue is addressed, we'd be sitting here and talking about whether a nuclear deal is good or bad, and what is a good nuclear deal and what is a bad nuclear deal. I think for once, some attention has to be paid to the people of Iran and their desires for a better future. As you said, a forward-looking modern future, which, as Ambassador Bloomfield said, was stolen from them when the Shah was overthrown by the mullahs.
You know, but isn't that the point? We're all sitting there fighting over centrifuges and the difference between a good deal and a bad deal, when what's really happening in the region, and this, have friends in the Arab world, but they've suffered from poor governance in the Arab world for a long time, and they have suffered from poor governance in Iran from both the time of the Shah and under the Ayatollahs. So there's been a dearth of sort of consent of the governed for a long, long time. And in Iran, more so than in the Arab world, there's been a call for it going back to 1906, if I'm not mistaken. So this is a perennial, multi-generational quest for popular sovereignty. Frankly, this is why I was a bit disappointed in the new national security strategy, which had an opportunity to sort of get back to basics and look at the trends that led to the colored revolutions in Central and Eastern Europe, in South America when the dictators went away, when the Soviet Union fell. There's been such a change. And finally, change came to Tunisia and Egypt with Tahrir Square, and it swept through. Syria, in Daraa, it was a demonstration. And the ruling clan clamped down and said, we're not going to let this go any further. And they fired on their own people, which should be an absolute red line, black letter law war crime. And yet we've defunded our special war crimes office in the State Department to doing anything on Syria, even though the Arab foreign ministers have called for Bashar to be sent to The Hague and to face charges. My point is, this is all tied into the Iran negotiation. If I wanted to get the attention of the supreme leader of Iran, I don't think I could do it by saying, want me to lift this sanction, and maybe I can lift this one over here and go to the UN and lighten that one up. I don't think that gets his attention at all. I think breaking through the information walls and showing where all their money is, how much they're giving to the Arabs from Lebanon to Iraq and other places in Yemen, when it's not going to the poor streets of South Tehran, that's the kind of thing that might get their attention. So I think the new tools are information. The new tools are use of force in a very limited way to back up political demands. We don't seem to have a playlist of what we want Assad and Hezbollah and the Iraqis to do. It's either we hit with drones and we sit back and it's all kinetic force with no political sort of agenda leading it. And I think we have a lot of work to do in Washington to get back to basics, live by our principles, make our approach consistent and understandable, and have something that we clearly stand for, that the peoples of the region, including 80 million Iranians, could say, yes, that's what I'm for as well. The Americans stand for the right things. We're not standing for the right things in the Middle East right now.
Just 2 points very, very quickly.
Please.
I think, first of all, there's sort of two clocks that people are looking at. One is definitely the regime change clock that you mentioned, and I don't think there's, I think there's very few commentators that wouldn't say that the problem with Iran is the regime, not just their pursuit of nuclear weapons, right? But there's the regime change clock, and then there's the nuclear weapons clock. The first one, I think, is anybody's guess what it's at, but it doesn't seem to be at months or years. The second one is. And so I think people would say we have to deal with the nuclear weapons issue first because that's the one that's going to come up first. And the second point, which gets to that, is the 35-year being on the cusp of revolution. Do you think that would happen? How do you think even 2009 would have played out if the regime had nuclear weapons? I think the chance for change becomes much, much smaller if they get nuclear weapons.
Thank you. I think we have time for maybe one more question. I think it was you, sir.
Okay. My name is Stuart Myers. I don't have a political background. So could you inform me? I mean, we've been talking about sanctions all evening. I have no idea what these sanctions really are. Could you, and I'm sure you can't give me an exhaustive rundown of what they are, but what exactly are we doing to Iran with the sanctions? And is there any way, what alternatives do we have? Can we do, what more can we do with sanctions if they don't comply?
Well, I think the heart of the sanctions have to do with the oil and gas sector, where a lot of Iran's riches are offshore in the Gulf. They share the biggest gas field in the world with Qatar, and then they have extensive oil fields off the coast in the Gulf, which require Western technology to be successfully exploited. You may recall I don't want to be unfair to a brand name, but there was a bit of a scandal concerning Conoco many years ago when it turned out that there was a negotiation between Conoco and, if I'm right about it, was it Conoco? and the Iranian oil company. And the Iranians wanted to announce the deal 2 days later, and so they panicked and told a few officials. And it became a scandal. Everyone denied at the boardrooms that they knew anything about it, when in fact that wasn't the case. The point being, it led to Senator D'Amato and President Clinton and his White House sort of having a bidding war to say, well, I'm going to make the sanctions even bigger. And they piled Libya in, so the Iran-Libya Sanctions Act was passed in Congress. We went to the UN and got consensus that if we were going to forego this lucrative opportunity for our oil companies, then the other major countries of the world, including Japan, would not move in behind us to take those opportunities. That's really the heart and soul of it. I think the more modern form of sanctions, some of which are executive orders, the president can prohibit certain kinds of activities, certain types of transactions, certain trade in goods, except for, pistachios, rugs, and one other item. There are executive sanctions that the president controls, but the Congress controls legislative sanctions. And what the new innovation, which I think has policymakers convinced that sanctions are a much sharper tool, is that the Treasury Department can locate the actual transactional nodes in the finance system where money moves, so that Iran finds it very difficult to bank around the world and to buy things and to execute contracts. And that's an inconvenience. Putin and his people are facing the same thing. It's better than what we used to have, but I submit to you, it is neither strategic nor dispositive. It's not the ultimate coercive tool. I've never seen any strong adversary fall to his knees under sanctions, and I don't ever expect to see that. So we better start thinking about, if we're serious about a red line, that thou shalt not have a nuclear weapon, you're not going to get it no matter what. Well, that's a heck of a wall that you just threw your cap over as the President of the United States. You better get over that wall and get the cap. How are you going to do that? I don't think you do it just with sanctions. That's my view.
Any other comments on that point? Andrew?
Maybe open to another question.
Okay. Okay. Well, I guess the panelists have time for yet another question. I think there was one. Ma'am, did you have a question in the front here? And then in the back? Or whoever had their hand up first. Okay.
My name is Daria. I'm actually a student from Sweden. So this conversation has been really unusual for me, but very interesting. So thank you for that. I would just like to ask you guys a simple question about the some people in Iran who actually believe that nuclear Iran is justified out of a fear of Israeli nuclear weapons. What would you say to such opinions?
I think there is the argument case that Israel both has a first strike and second strike capability. That's publicly known. But then the real question is, unfortunately, it's not a real fair situation for Iran. But unfortunately, I think from looking at from American national strategic interests, arguably it is not in American interest, and arguably other states in the P5+1 for Iran to have a nuclear weapons program. But sometimes there are those disparities, but I do think that in this case, to prevent broader proliferation and potentially a nuclear arms race in the Middle East, that would be, in my perspective, a greater good than trying to be equitable with Israel pursuing its own program, which it did, rather against those treaties. But it's a reality we live with, but one we shouldn't encourage in the region, frankly.
I guess what I have to add is that, historically speaking, I do not believe the territorial integrity of Iran has ever been threatened by a capable outside force. Even the war that Iraq started reached a very quick stalemate 2 years after, and the Iraqis withdrew from the Iranian border because, of course, in the first 2 years, even the Iranian opposition joined the war campaign to defend Iranian territory. I think you have to realize that this regime in Iran is suffering from a deficit of legitimacy and popular support, and that is why it needs a nuclear weapon for. It wants to exert its hegemony on the region. recall that in the many demonstrations that were happening in 2009, even during the so-called Quds Day, Jerusalem Day demonstrations at the end of the month of Ramadan, the last Friday of Ramadan, one of the prevailing slogans was Na Gaza, na Lebanon, Janam Fadaye Iran, which means neither Gaza nor Lebanon, I give my life for Iran. So the Iranian people, at least from my perspective, are not at all beguiled by the slogan that the regime itself has been putting forth, which is we need nuclear weapons to defend ourselves against some assumed enemy. I think the biggest enemy of Iran as a country, as a nation, is the regime that is ruling it. And I think if you look at it historically, remember Iran with its strategic location, with its population, with its everything that it has been always the 600-pound gorilla in the region. And it has been Iran that has been threatening, the Iranian regime that has been threatening other countries in the region. And of course, we're seeing very, very vivid examples of that now in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, and in Lebanon. So that's my take on this.
If I may, I think that there's something to be said for supporting norms that the rest of the world also seems to embrace. I think that's a good test of leadership, is whether there's any followers or not. So that to the extent that nations are all somewhat agreeing on rules of the game that would keep for a stable and secure world where everyone's interests are respected, then they enjoy more privilege. Some people say America has an exceptional role. They do play, they are accorded a role by many other countries. They defer to American power. We have a much bigger military. We're expected to use it responsibly according to the law of war. And so there are two takeaways from this. One is it's really important for the United States, even though we may be able to do a lot of things on a day-to-day basis, to try to act in a way that sets an example that essentially reinforces norms that other countries and other societies embrace, the rights of their citizens, et cetera. Whereas a country under the current leadership in Iran, which is undermining the capacity of states by militarizing non-state actors, secretly funneling them weapons, blowing up marketplaces and essentially violating Geneva Convention rules, in so many ways acting in contravention to the norms that many other countries hold dear and threatening to the international order, I think that diminishes their claim to having special privileges.
Okay, thank you. Any additional questions? Okay, maybe one more. Oh.
Thank you. Well, I have many, but I'll just stick to one.
Well,
okay, I'm Diane Perlman, School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason, and also a political psychologist, so I appreciate the psychology. After 9/11, as far as I understand, there were 1 million Iranians having candlelight vigils for us. And as we know, they helped us with intelligence to get al-Qaeda, and then Bush called them the axis of evil. So my question is, also that I'm interested in coercive policy and sanctions as opposed to, positive inducements or some balance between that. So I'm wondering what you think about, and people are more dangerous when they're afraid and humiliated and backed into a corner. So there's a part of our dynamics that ratchets up, escalates the tension. So I'm interested in what you think about what we can do now for positive inducements, or if there's any scenario you can imagine for reconciliation, tension reduction, or giving them a face-saving way out, like we did with the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Well, I would say that President Obama started his presidency by offering an open hand, which I think is as positive an inducement as an attitude towards negotiating with the Iranian people. He sent a Nowruz message in his first year in the administration. So, I think the Obama administration, on the one hand, has certainly had a very open attitude towards the Iranian regime. On the other hand, the response to the 2009 election crisis that happened afterwards, maybe not so open attitude towards the Iranian people. But I think you've definitely seen rhetoric from the administration that, while tough on the fact that they're going to prevent a nuclear weapon, has been very open to having negotiations. So I think you've actually had a fairly, compare that to the rhetoric of Israel, compare that to the rhetoric of Congress, you have seen that positive attitude on behalf of the administration.
Any other responses?
I'd like to see what the Supreme Leader says about the deal if there is a deal. If the Supreme Leader says, well, we got some sanctions relief, and yes, we conceded significantly on the nuclear program, that would be the same thing that the President will be saying. If they're both saying the same thing, that tells me that they actually came to some terms. If, on the other hand, the Supreme Leader is saying, we didn't give anything away, we pretty much, it was meaningless, and the sanctions are melting, so we won, I will come back to the point I tried to make earlier, which is to do this deal in a way that solves a huge strategic imperative, not to have the bomb. You have to treat them like a country of 80 million people. You may not like the Supreme Leader, but you have to respect a great country, whoever is leading it, if you're going to make a deal with their leader. And he has to be able to stand up and have a statesman-like position at the end of the negotiation that says, yes, we've made an agreement with the Americans. I know death to the Americans, but I made a deal with them, and here's what we got. And we'll wait and see if that happens. But I haven't seen us offer him that opportunity, and I haven't seen us ask the Congress to give us the negotiating room to make that a possibility. So I expect a fairly tepid deal that will have a lot of people fussing over a lot of small details, and everyone's going to need some Excedrin.
And frankly, on the optics, purely from Manama to Sana'a to Damascus to Beirut, it's a pretty good deal. It's a pretty good time for the Supreme Leader if he gets a deal. So I think there is this, yes, he may give up his nuclear program, but if he can say to the Iranian people that Iranian influence is at its peak or at its height now in the region, it's a pretty good, I think that is something he's probably much more happy to trumpet than just purely having a nuclear weapon. So I do think on the optics, it's a potential win-win for the Supreme Leader if he takes that deal.
And if I may just add one thing here, I think when you address this issue, you have to clearly distinguish between the people of Iran and the regime in power. And I think Iranian people, as one of the members of the audience mentioned, are very articulate. They experienced the Pahlavi dynasty for 50 years, the Shah and his father, and they have experienced the mullahs of Iran for 36 years now. And of course, the Iranian people are probably the most Western-friendly nation in the entire region. The problem are the rulers of Iran. And I think if you ask me what the Obama administration can do, is instead of so much worrying about making Khamenei or Rouhani angry, he should try to demonstrate to the Iranian people that the United States stands for what the Iranian people want, which, as I said earlier, is a democratic, free country where 14 million people do not have to sleep hungry every night, in a country that is sitting on an ocean of oil, in a country where you can't even now breathe the air because of the pollution, in a country where its resources are being spent on arming Hezbollah and Hamas and the Shiite militias in Iraq, and of course propping up a criminal regime like Bashar al-Assad. And I think this would make the Iranian people happy. Remember, and I think that many people in the audience who are from Iranian origin know this, that one of the most prevalent slogans in the streets of Iran was Obama ba unaya bama, ba mulaya bama, which, because as you may know, Obama in Farsi means he is with us. When you translate his name, it means he is with us. And the millions of Iranians were chanting at the height of the demonstrations in the streets of Iran, Obama, are you with the mullahs or are you with us? And I think, to be honest, now that you look back at 2009 and now that you look at the US policy toward Iran, I do not believe that the American administration has stood for the values and the aspirations of the Iranian people. And I think that has been the crux of the problem vis-a-vis the policy toward Iran. And unless and until this changes, again, we will be sitting in panel after panel, how many centrifuges, what is a good deal, what is a bad deal, what is the verification mechanism, and it will not get us anywhere until and unless you address the root of the problem, a regime that is hell-bent on exporting its revolution beyond its borders and, as they've said, establish a global Islamic empire. You know, a lot of people are worried about the Islamic State, ISIS. Well, there has been an Islamic State in place for 36 years in Iran. The very criminal, brutal punishments that you see ISIS undertake, which has outraged the world, the mullahs have enshrined them in their constitution. Just last week, they gouged out the eye of someone in retribution because he'd thrown acid on somebody else's face. So I think when you talk about this, and when you ask what should the U.S. administration do, they should try to take the side of the Iranian people instead of their oppressors.
Okay, I think on that note, we're going to have to close for this evening. Please join me in thanking our panelists for this very enlightening and interesting discussion and for staying with us. Okay. So I think for those of you who had additional questions, maybe you could catch them on their way out. Otherwise, I think we'll close here. Right. Thank you.
Thanks, Audra.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good questions.
Sounds good, definitely.
Good group.
Fantastic. Yeah. We should get lunch.
Yes,
as well.
definitely.
That'd be very
I'll
good.
be gone for about a week.
Okay.
You know, we have a big New Year celebration.
It was wonderful.